Welcome back. So what we're here to discuss now is a fun and fascinating, if slightly dangerous idea, and that's the idea of perverse incentives. And so we've talked about where the state can and should step in order to overcome market failures. But just because the state works to overcome a market failure doesn't mean they're going to do so. It doesn't mean it's going to go well. Perverse incentives this is very much the idea of policy gone wrong. And to understand that, we're going to focus in on the idea of incentives. So let's get started by thinking about that podcast you just got finished listening to. And in that podcast, of course, they're trying to fix the problem of traffic. Traffic is an issue that, because of poor infrastructure, because of overuse, it costs people lots of time. It costs economies lots of money. I grew up in this area. Here's Northern Virginia, my beloved homeland, and I've been stuck in exactly this point on the highway here, 495, for multiple hours. And I can tell you, it is infuriating. It is costly. It is suboptimal. And so, how should the state work to try and overcome this? Well, you might think the easiest way would be build more roads. We don't have enough lanes here, build more lanes, and we could alleviate the problem of traffic in our nation's capital and traffic riddled cities around the world. As of course you noticed in the podcast, however, that is not typically a useful solution. Typically, when people build more roads, there's just worse traffic still. And thinking about why that is, we have to think about the incentives it creates. So all of the various people that have to commute and have to get around in the DC area, if they think, oh wow, they just added 3 new lanes to the highway, I should drive my car. Well, everybody else is thinking that way. The incentive that building more roads creates is let's drive. And so it actually typically will create even more traffic. What did they end up finding actually led to better traffic outcomes? Actually putting tolls on entering cities and things like that, making it actually monetarily more expensive for people to drive. That changed the incentives. If I think, oh, I need to get to work, I could take public transportation, I could carpool, or I could just hop in my own car and get there on my own time. Well, that sounds great until I think, oh, wait, there's a $5 toll to enter the city where I work. So maybe I'll carpool, maybe I'll do something else. That seems to work in reducing the amount of traffic. And so the idea of perverse incentives is something that we are going to focus on a lot when we consider where should the state enter into the market, where should it regulate, where should it have new rules, new laws, new incentives. And this idea is simply that we really, really need to consider how these incentives will play out, because the best laid policy plans often can lead to the exact opposite outcome. The idea here is that we build more roads to try and fix traffic, we get more traffic, we get the exact opposite thing that we wanted. To think about this, we can think about an old story called the Cobra problem. Sorry for the scary image. So the Cobra problem comes from colonial India. And this was a situation where the British were sort of the colonial governors of India. And the British were, in Bombay, in Delhi, drinking their tea, enjoying themselves, but there was something they didn't like. There were cobras. Too many cobras for the British taste. And so they decided we need to do something about this. We need to have a policy to address the number of cobras that we're facing. And so they came up with a policy. That policy was they would give you a small cash sum for a dead cobra. The idea was simply we're going to create the incentive to hunt cobras and kill cobras by giving a little bit of money for a dead cobra. Now, of course, perverse incentives, we know the punchline here. This policy is going to backfire. And indeed, the incentives were not necessarily to go out and hunt cobras that were wild. Think about what you might do if you are living a tough life under British colonial rule in India. Well, they are really afraid of cobras, these British. So what a lot of people did was just started little cobra farms of their own. They started actually breeding cobras under captivity, and when you need some money, you'd kill a few cobras, you'd go to the governor's office and you get some money for those dead cobras. And so actually the incentive, the policy that the British made of paying for dead cobras backfired and had unintended consequences of actually more cobras. Now, the British eventually figured this out. They're pretty smart. and they made the policy go away. They said, okay, this is just incentivizing you to farm cobras. We're not going to pay for this any longer. Well, what do you think happened then? You are an entrepreneur, a cobra farmer in Bombay, and all of a sudden you have this, room filled with cobras in captivity. It's not a great thing to have in your house, with your family. And so what did they do? They got rid of the cobras. People just went out and let their cobras free. And so this is, I think, the greatest example of how perverse incentives can work. There's a policy in order to try and address an issue. It doesn't calculate the incentives that the policy creates correctly, right? They thought that it would create the incentive to hunt wild cobras. It actually created the incentive to breed cobras. Well, that backfired in a major way, and there's a little bit of an uptick in the cobra problem that the British were facing because of these perverse incentives and because of this bad policy. So I hope that was clear. Of course, if it's not, always get in touch on the module Q&A board. Have a really wonderful day.